This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by NYSE Governance Services Corporate Board Member, along with Governance Knowledge Partners, the Center for Audit Quality, and Grant Thornton, and contributing partners, National Investor Relations Institute, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.
Welcome to this edition of This Week in the Boardroom. I'm TK Kerstetter, Chairman of the NYSE Governance Services Corporate Board Member, and this is our New Year's show, the first show of 2014. And here to help me kick it off, as is our tradition, is Scott Cutler, the EVP of the NYSE. And welcome, Scott.
It's great to be here.
Well, this is the show where we get to look forward. And I think if there's any show that if I was a viewer, I would want to be interested in is sort of our opinion about what we see as the trends in 2014. What do people need to be sensitive to as they plan their board meetings and hold their meetings in the coming year? So since I took the liberty of being first at the last show that closed out 2013, it's only right of me to offer you the opening salvo, if you will, on what trends you want to talk about.
Yeah, so I think that I wouldn't qualify it necessarily as a trend, but I think we're going to actually see some activity this year in and around proxy advisory firms. And why I think that's the case is we talked about last show the rise of shareholder engagement. That's really led by withhold vote types of campaigns. We have an entire infrastructure today among institutional shareholders that haven't quite outsourced, but look to the proxy advisory firms for a lot of matters related to voting and governance. On the other hand, you've got corporations that over the last number of years have almost outsourced many of their decisions to what the proxy advisory firms may say, and tailoring compensation programs and strategic decisions around what is ultimately going to be the response of the advisory firms. The SEC had a hearing in December to talk about that role and influence, bring up some of the conflicts that arise with advisory firms in the middle of that. And so I expect that 2014, this is going to be an area where we're either going to see more regulation or we're going to see a lot more activity and focus. And I think that's going to come from the regulators, and it's also going to come from the marketplace. Companies are already doing a lot better job, not necessarily incorporating all of the opinions of the shareholder advisory firms, but being in a better position to disclose and being in a better position to argue in favor of what they see as the decisions that the board and the management teams are making. And I think at the same time, institutions aren't necessarily relying on the shareholder advisory firms only. So again, it covers lots of different topics, but that would be my big observation for 14.
Well, as we know, whenever we get together with shareholders, this is a very sensitive issue, to them. And I think the things that we've learned in the past is that, a Glass-Lewis or an ISS no vote is not necessarily a death sentence. We're seeing more and more shareholders vote on their own. They take the research from Glass-Lewis and ISS, but they're, if you're a T. Rowe Price or you're a Vanguard or whatever, they're really very independent about how they're voting, which I think is a sort of a positive movement, in that sense. I would hope that, as the directors feel more and more comfortable and understand even how to communicate with the ISS, obviously you can't communicate with them during proxy season. And if you want to be frustrated, just try and do that, or maybe even correct an error, which is a problem. But we're seeing more and more people savvy about how to communicate with the proxy advisory firms. And that's lowering sort of the temperature threshold, if you will, that people are getting a little more comfortable. Still not, I wouldn't say that it's anywhere perfect, but on the counter that they say, listen, we don't vote the shares, we're just doing research. But you and I both know that that's still a pretty powerful thing, and that's what I think that the Senate hearings or the congressional hearings that went on they want to say, should there be any accountability here with the influence that these organizations have?
Right. All right. So what's your top trend for 2014?
I think that my top trend is board composition, and there's a lot of variables in that, but I think that more than any other year, people are going to be thinking through the idea of what kind of skill sets do I need. And in the last show, you had talked about the cyber risk and that. And I don't think you can go out and get single purpose directors. I don't think you can go out to somebody that just knows HR or just knows cybersecurity or just knows that. I don't think that makes sense, you know. But if you have a skill set, for example, if somebody managed a large division but equally had IT experience, you know, that's going to rise. International, global experience is another thing that I would see, you know, rising to the occasion. So there, if you couple that with the pressure for boards to, what you're going to hear a new phrase said more and more, refresh your board, okay? And when you see, by refreshing, they mean getting some turnover, okay, to where directors aren't serving, you know, 20, 25 years, and that you've got people that are current about social media, about IT governance, about all the changes that are occurring in business. I think that that's going to be a trend, and that affects other trends as well.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I mean, the recruit and retain is still an issue, right? I mean, you still have to be able to find the right board members, retain them on your board. I still think that's a challenge. But I think to your point of refreshment, look, the big reality is that tenure of board is something that all boards should look at. Diversity of board, we've talked about it. That's certainly an issue that comes up. And then I think experience. Those are the three things that I would look to when you're looking at the idea of board composition. And, you know, quite frankly, with an evolving and changing landscape in every single industry, board composition has to be at the top of every chair of the board to sit there and say, do we really have a board that is positioned to be able to address the needs of the management team and the company in every regard? And I think you're right in putting that at the very top of the list.
Well, the discussion will continue with the idea of board tenure. That's, you know, refreshing the board is one word that you'll hear. Board tenure is going to be another. If you look around the globe, there's a lot of parts of a lot of countries that classify a director as not non-independent anymore after they pass the period of about 10 years. And that's going to be a discussion that happens. Probably the most prevalent way that we see right now on board refreshment is retirement age, okay? Nobody likes that because they don't want to get rid of directors that are good directors. Yet sometimes it's the best thing to do. People don't like, even though a fair number, you know, probably over 10% of the companies have term limits, okay? You know, just like everybody's in favor of term limits until it affects them, okay? Whether you're in Congress or serving on a board, you know, that's the problem. But interestingly enough, and you'll see some research that's coming out from us in the new year, the most desired way to refresh a board, without question, from both management and from the directors themselves, is board evaluations, okay?
Yeah.
And the only way to do that really is sort of a peer-to-peer kind of situation where you evaluate each other. Companies have to get used to that process. At the same time, that again is the idea of using evaluations to eliminate directors makes existing people nervous. But it gets back to the point that we talked about in our 2013 session, board leadership, and you just made reference to it as well. If you don't have somebody that's managing the board leadership of, you know, getting rid of the dead wood, you know, and I say dead wood, PwC's most recent annual survey asked the question, which corporate board member used to ask every year, is, are there members of your board that you think should be replaced? This year, 35% of the company said yes, there were. Okay, so, all that is throwing, are things that have to be dealt with. And then you had also mentioned diversity.
Yeah.
Diversity, we haven't seen numbers change in the way of gender and race. And that's because there isn't a lot of turnover. So refreshing boards is going to be important in that case too.
Okay, so my second, or it's our third trend overall, is really going to feel like an old one, but it's executive compensation. You may say, hey, look, we're into our fourth year of Say on Pay. We're in a well-worn path in terms of how much of a focus this is by shareholders, but we also have new proposed activity around the CEO pay ratio. That is something that could be part of the 2015 proxy season. We also have rules that are pending around pay per performance disclosure and clawback provisions that are still coming out of Dodd-Frank. My point in raising this is that a lot of these are going to be new issues. They have new types of implications for both compensation as well as performance-related compensation. And so with those new rules coming in place, you're going to have new disclosures, and these are going to be issues that we're going to face in the 2015 type of proxy season. So I think boards need to be prepared for a new twist on this discussion and be prepared from a disclosure and a positioning perspective to be able to handle those issues in advance of next year. And so that I'll put that on a forward-thinking board is already thinking about this.
Yeah, I wish you were wrong. With that, I really do.
Yeah.
But I know that you aren't. And what's going to happen this year, and we'll see this in proxy season, is, when you looked at 2009, 2010, 2011, the sort of the buildup of shares granted, that had low thresholds to them, okay? And, some people are exercising some of these before they go. And I think you're going to see some big numbers out there, okay? Because, and to those companies' credits, they have performed. There's nothing wrong with their plan per se, okay? But the sheer the sheer size of some of those numbers always touch a nerve, okay? And I think it's going to bring all that into center focus. And I'm not sure that we're going to feel like we've made a lot of progress in this area, right, because it's just so sensitive.
Yeah, it turns out when the S&P is up in double digits for the second year in a row, that compensation will as well.
Yeah, and in the good runs, people are relatively comfortable with that. But as soon as there's a little slippage in performance overall or whatever, then that all of a sudden becomes a real big issue. And as a board member, it's tough to look. One of the things to do is making sure that you're looking out over the 10-year period and saying what wealth is going to be accumulating. You do have to be realistic to know that those numbers are going to be thrown back at you, and you're going to have things that is this pay, realistic. So, well, listen, that is our best guess. Now, we purposely don't go back and look at what we predicted, the previous year. But I would suspect that we at least hit on 2 or 3 of the issues that ended up being that. So I hope we have that same track record going forward. So this is a start, our first one in 2014. I'll look forward to all the topics that we'll talk about this year. And as usual, there'll be no shortage of fodder for us to discuss this. So that will conclude this first edition in 2014 of This Week in the Boardroom. We hope you enjoyed the show and our look forward. We're here in lovely Times Square, as you can see in the background. Again, we want to thank our group for just unlimited budget on being creative on our show backdrops. Also, I want to remind everybody that we have our next compensation boot camp that's going to be held in Fort Lauderdale on January 30th and 31st. If you want to get all the latest advanced information on your pay. We do this with Equilar, which, as you know, is one of the leading providers of compensation information. If you can join us, you're serving on a comp committee, we'll certainly welcome you. So with that, we'll see you next week where we try and cover another critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. We'll see you then.
Join us again next week for This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by NYSE Governance Services, Corporate Board Member, along with Governance Knowledge Partners, the Center for Audit Quality, and Grant Thornton, and contributing partners, National Investor Relations Institute, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.